Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new video, and today's video is actually going to be a little bit different. We are going to be discussing a true crime case, but in a different kind of format. In today's video, we're going to be discussing the case of Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter, and this video is actually sponsored by Now TV. I'm going to be working with them on a few of my upcoming videos, which is really exciting because I absolutely love Now TV. For those of you who don't know, Now TV is a really great UK streaming service who have just launched their brand new Sky crime channel, which I am very excited about, and I'm guessing since you guys watch my channel you'll be quite excited about it as well. The Sky Crime channel launched on the 1st of October, and honestly there is a whole range of premium content available to watch over there, from serial killer cases to bizarre unsolved disappearance cases to crazy and twisted love cases like the case that we're going to be discussing today. In this video we're going to be discussing a two-part documentary made by HBO called I Love You Now Die: The Commonwealth vs Michelle Carter. The documentary is about the death of Conrad Roy, and I'm sure most of you will have heard of this case. It's a very well-known case, but for those who don't, I will give you guys a brief summary of the case at the start of the video. The documentary that we're going to be discussing in this case, I Love You Now Die, is available to stream right now on the Sky Crime channel, which you can access on Now TV through their entertainment pass, which is £8.99 a month, which honestly, for the amount of stuff you get on it, is 100% worth it. If you want to go and check it out, I will leave a link in the description of this video. So how this video is going to work is, at the start I'm going to give you a brief summary of the Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter case, just for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the case. And then after that I'm going to be discussing the two-part documentary, which I have obviously watched and I thought was really good. I've made so many notes on it which I really want to discuss with you guys. I would really love it if we could get a discussion going about this case and the documentary, because this case is such a controversial one and I would just love to hear your guys' opinion about it. That being said, please do be mindful of the people involved in the case when you are writing your comments, and also please respect other people's opinions. If you don't agree with someone's opinion, that's obviously absolutely fine, and by all means let's get a discussion going in the comments, but I don't want anyone being horrible to someone else or bullying someone else if they don't have the same opinion as you. Remember, we are all entitled to our own opinions. I just want to clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with this case. I will just quickly say as well before we actually get into the video that this case does involve the themes of suicide and mental health and stuff, so that's just a kind of trigger warning if anyone is very sensitive to those topics. Conrad Henry Roy III was an 18-year-old boy from Mattapoisett in southeastern Massachusetts in the US. Conrad was a very sporty and athletic person. He really enjoyed baseball and rowing and running, just various different sporting activities. Conrad worked for several years with his grandfather, father and uncle in the family's marine salvage business, and in 2014 he earned his captain's license and he graduated on the honour roll, so with the highest grades from his high school. From an outsider's point of view, it would appear as though Conrad had a happy and normal life. However, he actually struggled a lot with his mental health, and he had done for years before this case took place. Conrad struggled massively with social anxiety and depression, and he had seen many therapists and counsellors over the years. However, it never seemed to work for him. Therapy never seemed to work for him. And when Conrad was 17 years old, he actually attempted suicide by overdosing on paracetamol. At the time of his overdose, he was actually talking to a girl online, and she actually contacted the police and got Conrad some help. When Conrad was 16 years old, he actually met a 15-year-old girl named Michelle Carter. They met in Florida, where I believe they were both visiting their relatives, and they actually only saw each other in person like a handful of times. However, they developed a really close relationship over text message. Michelle also suffered from a few mental illnesses. She had been struggling with an eating disorder since the age of 8 or 9, and she also suffered with depression, and she also had a history of self-harm. And she had been taking prescription psychiatric medication since the age of 14 years old. So like I said, the two, Michelle and Conrad's relationship was mostly online. They would literally text each other like 24/7, and they soon began calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend. They talked about their mental illnesses together, and at the beginning they were like each other's support system in a way. CONRAD would express to Michelle that he was feeling suicidal and that he wanted to die, and she was there for him in the beginning. She would convince him not to take his own life, and she would suggest to him that he seeks professional help. CONRAD would look up on the internet like suicide methods, and he would send Michelle pictures of like nooses and guns, etc. And he would also say to Michelle that the two of them should be like Romeo and Juliet at the end. Obviously at the end, Romeo and Juliet kill themselves, and Michelle would say, no, we're not gonna die. I don't want you or I to die. However, Michelle's attitude soon changed, and instead of encouraging him to get professional help and trying to convince him not to kill himself, she actually switched and she began trying to convince him to commit suicide. In fact, it was more like harassing him to take his own life. She would constantly text him and ask him, why haven't you killed yourself yet? Like, if you really wanted to do it, you would have done it by now. And she would also suggest to him ways in which he could kill himself. She would say, or you could drink bleach, or you could hang yourself, or there's carbon monoxide poisoning. So I'm going to read you some of the text between the two now. Bear in mind that there are literally hundreds of texts, and obviously I'm only going to read you a few, but a lot of them are shown in the documentary, which we'll talk about later. But I'm going to read you a few now just as an example of what their conversations would be like. So on the 12th of July 2014, CONRAD texts Michelle saying, I don't know why I'm like this, like why am I so hesitant lately? He's talking about his suicide, like why is he so hesitant to commit suicide? And Michelle replied to that text saying, sometimes things happen and we never have the answers why. She then follows that up with, you're so hesitant because you keep overthinking it and pushing it off. You just need to do it, CONRAD. The more you push it off, the more it will eat at you. She then said, you're ready and prepared. All you have to do is turn on the generator and be free and happy. No more pushing it off and no more waiting. She would also make CONRAD feel really bad for putting off his own suicide. Like he would say, oh, I'm going to kill myself eventually. I just don't know where. And she responded saying, not finding a place to go isn't an excuse. And on July the 12th, 2014, CONRAD left his home and drove in his pickup truck to a Kmart parking lot in Fairhaven in Massachusetts. And this was the day that he was going to kill himself. A few hours before he did, his girlfriend Michelle actually texted CONRAD and asked if he had deleted the messages between the two, because obviously if anyone ever found them, then they would know Michelle's part in his death. When he got to the parking lot, he ran a gasoline-powered water pump so that his car would fill with carbon monoxide and he would die sitting in the car. However, as the truck began filling with the toxic fumes, CONRAD actually got out of the truck because he realized that it was working and he was getting scared and he tried to save himself. And so he got out of the truck and he rang his girlfriend Michelle, and obviously because it was a phone call, we don't know exactly what was said. However, we do know that Michelle told him to get back into the truck. And we know this because Michelle actually later texted her friend Sam Boardman and told her that she told CONRAD to get back into the truck and that his death was her fault. So CONRAD did what his girlfriend said and he got back into the truck and he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. And after CONRAD's suicide, Michelle started acting like this heartbroken and grieving girlfriend. She was desperate for the sympathy and attention that her boyfriend's suicide was bringing her. She was speaking to CONRAD's family after his death and she was apologizing to them for not being able to save him. She said she tried so hard to save him, and she actually also asked for some of CONRAD's ashes, which obviously his family thought was so weird. CONRAD only actually met Michelle a handful of times. Yes, they spoke all the time over text message, but his family didn't even really know of Michelle, and she was asking for some of his ashes, which, like I said, they thought was so weird. However, soon police actually got a hold of the text messages between CONRAD and Michelle. Obviously, they deleted the messages, but police have a way of getting them back, and they soon began piecing together what actually happened, and Michelle Carter was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. The case went to trial and Michelle Carter was found guilty and she was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. However, this was later reduced to 15 months in prison and 5 years probation. However, even though she was sentenced in 2017, she only actually began serving her time in prison this year in 2019 because her legal team managed to keep her out of prison whilst they were trying to appeal appeal her sentence. So now that I've given you a brief summary on the case, I'm now going to tell you about the documentary, which, like I said, is available on Sky Crime through Now TV. So if you will want to watch it, then the link will be in the description of this video. The documentary is split into two parts. There's part 1 and part 2, and what I've kind of done is I've taken like topics and quotes from each part that I found really interesting and that I want to discuss with you guys. Like I said before, please let me know what you guys think about the documentary and the things that I'm about to discuss. I really want to get a discussion going in the comments, but like I said, be respectful to other people's opinions. So the documentary is about whether Michelle Carter is to blame for Conrad Roy's death. Can you convince someone to kill themselves over text message? And if you can, is that a crime? Should Michelle Carter be criminally responsible for it? The documentary just takes such an in-depth look at both sides of the argument, at the prosecution side and the defence's side. So part 1 of the documentary is called The Prosecution. It's presenting you with the prosecution's case and theories and their point of view. And the prosecution's job is obviously to convince the judge, because Michelle actually declined her right to a jury trial, so they were actually presenting their cases to the judge and he was the one to decide whether she was guilty or not guilty. Their job is to convince the judge that Michelle Carter caused Conrad's death. So the beginning of part 1 of the documentary, I think, gave a really good introduction to the case. It shows some of the text messages exchanged between Michelle and Conrad, and for someone who doesn't know the case, it sets it up really well for them. A few minutes in, we hear from the prosecution in the trial, and a really interesting quote from the prosecutor was, "She, as in Michelle, assisted and devised and advised and planned his suicide. She reasoned him out of his reservations. She told him that once he was dead, he would be free and happy. She pushed him to kill himself sooner rather than later, and she used Conrad as a pawn in her sick game of life and death." And I think that that last part of that quote from the prosecution, used Conrad as a pawn in her sick game of life and death, really kind of sums up this case well. It shows how the prosecution believed that Michelle was playing with Conrad, playing with his mind, playing with his emotions in order to get what she wanted. Because she wanted the sympathy, she wanted the attention by being the grieving girlfriend. I think using the word pawn sums up what she did perfectly. The word pawn literally means a person used by others for their own purposes. And the prosecution believed that's exactly what Michelle Carter did to Conrad. She used him for her own personal gain. About 24 minutes into part 1 of the documentary, we start to hear from Michelle's defense attorney, Joseph Cataldo. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing his name right. And he said a few things that I really wanted to include in this video. So the documentary shows how the defense begin to discuss the fact that there is no law in Massachusetts that criminalizes encouragement of suicide, which is obviously true. However, there is an involuntary manslaughter law that talks about wanton and reckless behaviour resulting in the death of someone. So basically exactly what it says, reckless behaviour resulting in the death of someone. And the fact that the defence don't think that what Michelle did was reckless behaviour that resulted in Conrad's death, I'm like... And the defence responds to this by saying that if Michelle Carter was physically present at the scene, if she was there instead of on the phone to him, because if you remember, Conrad got out of the truck and he then phoned Michelle, who told him to get back in. Well, the defense was saying it would be different if Michelle was physically there telling him to get back into the truck instead of over the phone, which I don't see that at all. I don't really see how her being physically there and telling him to get back in the truck is different to her being on the phone with him and telling him to get back into the truck. What do you guys think about that? Let me know in the comments. But there are two quotes in the documentary from Joseph Cataldo, Michelle's defense attorney, that I wanted to discuss with you guys. So the first quote from Joseph says that the idea that your speech alone in the way of text messages and words on the telephone can equal a manslaughter charge, I think is a dangerous precedent. The other quote is, it's going to have a potential chilling effect on free speech rights and about whether or not people can openly discuss suicide. And I personally don't think that that last part that he said about whether or not people can openly discuss suicide has anything to do with this case. I don't think that Michelle pushing him and convincing him and harassing him to take his own life is the same as openly discussing suicide. Suicide today is still a very taboo subject. People don't like to talk about it and they don't like to open up about it, and we should encourage people to open up about it. We should be there for someone and we should listen to someone and encourage people to get help if they express suicidal thoughts. But that's not what Michelle is doing, and I think by Joseph saying, oh, it's going to have a chilling effect on whether or not people can openly discuss suicide, he's completely missing what Michelle was actually doing. Michelle and Conrad aren't openly discussing suicide in that sense. They were at the beginning when Conrad was telling Michelle that he was feeling suicidal. She would encourage him to get help and she would listen to him, which is what she should have done, which is what we should all do if someone expresses suicidal thoughts or suicidal tendencies. However, as we know from the text messages towards the end of his life, that wasn't the case. She was telling him to commit suicide. She was harassing him. So I don't understand why Joseph said, oh, it's going to have a chilling effect on whether we can openly discuss suicide. We can discuss suicide. People should open up when they're feeling suicidal. But that's not what was going on here, and in my opinion that has nothing to do with what was actually going on. I hope that makes sense, what I've just said. Of course, if you disagree with me or you have a different opinion, let me know in the comments. But like I said, please be respectful, we all have our own opinions. So going on to what he said about free speech rights, I think he said it's going to have a potential chilling effect on free speech rights. Yes, we do all have free speech rights. We all have free will. We all have the right to express our opinions. But that doesn't make it okay to do what Michelle did. So if I was to bully someone, does that mean I can justify it by saying, oh, well, I have free speech rights? No, that doesn't make it okay. And the other quote that I mentioned from Joseph that said, the idea that your speech alone in the way of text messages and words on the telephone can equal a manslaughter charge, I think is a dangerous precedent. And I don't agree with that either. And the fact that he's saying it's a dangerous precedent, for those of you who don't know what precedent is, I actually have this thing off Google. I typed in define precedent because I didn't actually know what it meant. But it means in common law legal systems, a precedent or authority is a legal case that establishes a principle or rule. So the fact that he's saying the idea that your speech alone in the way of text messages can equal a manslaughter charge is a dangerous precedent, I think it's the complete opposite. What kind of message is that giving to cyberbullies, people who literally bully people through text messages? If Michelle Carter was to walk free, what kind of message are we giving to them? That it's okay if you bully someone if it's over text message? That it's okay to tell someone to commit suicide if it's over text message or on the telephone, as long as it's not in person like the defense were arguing earlier? Because like I touched on earlier, we also see in the documentary the defense arguing that if Michelle was physically present, if she was there at the scene and then told Conrad to get back in the car, then that would be different. But because it was over the phone, it shouldn't equal a manslaughter charge. But I really don't see their reasoning there. I don't see how telling someone to get back into a truck that is filling with carbon monoxide over the phone and telling them that in person is different. Let me know what you guys think about that in the comments. So later in part 1 of the documentary, it shows the prosecution bringing forward a few of Michelle's school friends as witnesses in the trial. And these girls talked about how Michelle was quite needy. They were quite friendly with her in school, but they weren't like great friends. They didn't socialise with Michelle out of school and they didn't want to. It seemed as though Michelle Carter always felt as though she had no friends, and she obviously didn't like this. And so the prosecution believe that she needed something, Michelle needed something to get these girls' attention so they would pay attention to her. One of these girls that gave evidence in the trial was a girl named Samantha Boardman. You might recognise her name because I mentioned her earlier on in the video. She was the girl that Michelle texted and told her that Conrad's death was her fault, and she told Conrad to get back into the truck. Now, a few days before Conrad's actual suicide, Michelle was texting Sam and she was telling her that she was really worried about her boyfriend Conrad because he was missing, he was suicidal, he wasn't in a good place, and she was worried that he was gonna do something. But at the same time that she was texting Sam and saying to her, oh, I'm really worried about Conrad, he's missing, all of this, she was actually texting Conrad and suggesting to him ways in which he could kill himself, asking him, when are you going to do it? When are you going to kill yourself? Why haven't you done it yet? So he wasn't missing, she was lying. And in the documentary, it shows how the prosecution believed that Michelle did this to kind of test out the suicide. She wanted to see how Sam and her other friends would react to Conrad's death before it actually happened. She wanted to see if the reaction they would give was the reaction that she wanted. About 43 minutes into part 1 of the documentary, they start discussing Homers for Conrad, which was basically a baseball tournament that Michelle set up after Conrad's death in memory of him and to raise awareness for suicide and mental health. However, Michelle actually arranged for this baseball match to take place in her hometown in Plainville, not in Conrad's hometown, which everyone of course found really weird. It's a match in memory of Conrad, so why isn't it taking place in his hometown where his friends and family live? However, when Michelle was confronted about this, she wasn't willing to move it to Conrad's hometown. She also set up a Facebook page for Homers for Conrad, and this Facebook page was getting a lot of attention. And she texted her friends saying, "Hey, I put the Homers for Conrad on Facebook. I'm like famous now, haha, check it out." And in the documentary, it shows how the prosecution suggests that Homers for Conrad was giving Michelle exactly what she wanted. It was giving her the attention that she craved so badly. It's just insane to me how in the weeks after his death and at Homers for Conrad, she was acting like this grieving girlfriend who was doing as much as she could for suicide awareness and mental health awareness, when she was the one who was pushing him to commit suicide in the first place. Towards the end of part 1 of the documentary, there is a discussion about teenage girls and how people believe that Michelle Carter almost represents teenage girls of today. As said in the documentary, some people believe that teenage girls are coercive and have a secret power that men don't have, and that they only live for attention and that all they want is to be popular, which, me having been a teenage girl, I don't think I was like that, and I don't think all teenage girls are like that, so I don't agree with that part, obviously. Dr. Peter Breggin, who is an American psychiatrist, says in the documentary, "Men are terrified of women. We all struggle with that." Which I suppose I can't really comment on that because I'm a woman. But he then goes on to talk about witches and how women have this control over men, and that part of the documentary I find really interesting. I want to know your guys' opinion on that. When you watch it, please come back and let me know what you think about that part. Joseph Cataldo, Michelle's defense attorney, then goes on to say in the documentary how this case has been twisted and portrayed differently in the media, which I can kind of see. It happens in most cases. News outlets will come up with headlines to grab people's attention and to get more clicks and to get more views. And like I said, I do kind of agree with what he said there, because I feel like sometimes the media will write and publish articles about topics before they actually know all the facts about a case. The end of part 1 of the documentary begins to delve into Michelle and her history of mental illness, the fact that she had an eating disorder, the fact that she had depression and she struggled with self-harm. And something that I picked up from this part of the documentary is that Michelle is someone who suffers greatly from paranoia. She needed constant reassurance from people that she was liked. Like we discussed earlier, she was always very needy with her friends, and as talked about in the documentary, she always wanted to meet up with her friends, but they never really wanted to meet up with her. And like I said, I got the impression that she was quite a paranoid person. She like I said, she needed constant reassurance that people liked her. And on that level, I can kind of identify with Michelle, I suppose, because I suffer with anxiety, and a lot of my anxiety is paranoia, if that makes sense. I get very paranoid that people don't like me, and like her, I kind of need constant reassurance that I'm liked and that people like me, which is really annoying, but it's the truth. I also get the impression that she was a very lonely person, and although that does not excuse what she did at all, it did make me feel quite sad for her. At the end of part 1 of the documentary, there is a really interesting quote by the prosecutor during the trial. It's a really long quote, so just bear with me. To suggest that he had his own free will, and we all do to an extent, and he could have just ignored her, is an oversight oversimplification of what was going on here. Between the statements of "why haven't you done it yet" and things of that nature were other words, and they were words of love. Although it may seem odd that I'm suggesting that words of love could be considered reckless, I think they are here when you look at the circumstances. She knew that he had social anxiety, she knew that he was depressed, she knew of his frailties because he confided in her. But not only that, she knew herself. She knew what it was like to be lonely, and as June turned into July, she turned that into "I love you, kill yourself." And if I'm understanding that quote from the prosecution right, I completely agree with that. I think that if Michelle was a total stranger to Conrad and she was texting him saying "kill yourself, here's ways to do it, get back into the truck," I don't think he would have listened. But in Conrad's eyes, because it was coming from someone who he thought loved him and cared about him and had his best interests at heart, because it was coming from that person, he listened and he got back into the truck. Because Michelle would text Conrad and say, "oh, I love you," and then in the next text she would say, "why haven't you killed yourself yet?" And I think between those texts was a further attempt from Michelle to manipulate Conrad, if that makes sense. She wanted him to believe that she only had his best interests at heart, and maybe in her mind she did. And that actually leads me on to part 2 of the documentary, where they discuss this further. So part 2 of the documentary is called The Defense, so it's obviously presenting the defense's side of the argument. And around the start of part 2 we are shown text messages between Michelle and Conrad where they talk about how they've both seen the devil and how they are both destined for hell. As we know, Michelle was taking antidepressants, and Dr. Peter Breggin, who, if you remember, is an American psychiatrist, says that probably the most common adverse effect of antidepressants is nightmares, so this is just spot on. She's clearly out of her mind, and so is he. Because obviously it's not really normal behaviour to discuss having seen the devil, and so he's saying that the two, Michelle and Conrad, were clearly out of their minds. Defence calls Dr. Peter Breggin to the stand in the trial to testify for Michelle in Michelle's favour, and the defence basically wanted him to give his opinion on whether Michelle's medications, the prescription medications that she was taking at the time, would have had an effect on her judgment on things. So basically I think the angle that the defence are trying to take here is they are trying to claim that yes, Michelle did what she did, however her actions were a result of the medications that she was taking at the time, the antidepressants, because antidepressants obviously have side effects. And in the documentary we see Dr. Peter Breggin say that in his opinion, when Michelle was telling and pushing Conrad to end his life, she was actually involuntary intoxicated. When he was asked in court what involuntary intoxication means, Dr. Breggin says, by definition, it's an intoxication which means that the neurochemistry of the brain has been disrupted and that this intoxication is observable through thoughts, behaviours and activities. They involve in general things like impulsivity and impaired judgment. So in Dr. Peter Breggin's opinion, in Michelle's mind, she thought she was doing the right thing. She thought that she was helping Conrad, in fact. After this, in the documentary, we see the prosecutor Katie Rayburn cross-examine Dr. Peter Breggin, and Dr. Breggin claims that Michelle became involuntarily intoxicated on the 2nd of July 2014. And the prosecution responds to this by saying, well, between the 2nd of July and the 12th of July, Michelle was speaking to a therapist, and this therapist concluded that Michelle seemed like she was doing fine. She seemed normal. She said that there were no abnormalities. She didn't appear, as Dr. Peter Breggin would call it, involuntary intoxicated, as he suggested. I feel like I didn't explain that part very well, but basically Dr. Peter Breggin was saying that he believes that when Michelle was texting Conrad and saying, end your life, how are you going to do it, when are you going to do it, she was involuntarily intoxicated. So in other words, she wasn't in her normal state of mind. But the prosecution was saying, well, how come her therapist didn't pick up on that then? How come her therapist said that she seemed normal and fine? And so with this in mind, how could Michelle have thought that she was doing the right thing if her therapist didn't pick up on any abnormalities? I feel like this whole part in part 2 of the documentary is one of the most interesting parts because I can kind of see both sides of the argument here. What do you guys think about that? What do you think about Dr. Peter Breggin and the whole involuntary intoxication thing? Please let me know in the comments. Later on in part 2 of the documentary, they start to tell us about the fact that there are a lot of text messages between Michelle and Conrad, text messages that Michelle sent to Conrad, where she would reference different films and TV shows, particularly the TV show Glee. For those of you who haven't seen it, Glee is an American TV show which is based on teenagers in high school. And the two main characters in Glee was a football player or quarterback called Finn Hudson, who was played by Corey Monteith, and an aspiring singer called Rachel Berry, who was played by Lea Michele. In the show, the two main characters, Rachel and Finn, were a couple, and the actors who played Rachel and Finn, Corey Monteith and Lea Michele, were also a couple outside of the show, so in real life. However, in 2013, Corey Monteith actually overdosed and he died. And so the show made a special tribute episode to Corey Monteith and his character Finn, who had died. And Michelle Carter was obsessed with this, and she would pull lines from the tribute episode that Rachel had said, and she would copy them and use them in her own life. People believe that she saw this horrible situation between Rachel and Finn and the actors in real life, Lea and Corey, and she wanted to make that situation happen in her own life. So like I said, she would take lines from the show and tweet them word for word, and she would send them to Conrad, and she wanted to make what happened to the characters Rachel and Finn, and also the actors in real life, Lea and Corey, she wanted to make what happened to them happen to her and Conrad. And this just adds to the whole idea that she wanted to be like the grieving girlfriend, like the character Rachel and like Lea Michele. But I think that it also adds to Dr. Peter Bregin's theory that she was involuntarily intoxicated and that she wasn't living in reality. She was living in her own fantasy and she wasn't in a normal state of mind. I don't know if I explained that very well. Honestly, they do a much better job of explaining it in the documentary. At the end of the documentary, we are shown the defence's and the prosecution's closing arguments, and then we are shown the judge's verdict, which is obviously guilty. And like I mentioned earlier, Michelle is currently serving her 15-month sentence in jail. So that's kind of everything that I wanted to cover from the documentary. I kind of picked out topics from part 1 and part 2 and quotes and stuff like that and discussed it with you guys. Honestly, I could have gone on, but this video would be so long, and you guys need to go and watch the documentary for yourself because this case is so crazy. In my opinion, the documentary does a really good job at presenting the case from both sides, from the prosecution side and the defence's side. And it does really make you think from both points of view. It's a very like thinky what I mean is, it's a documentary that really gets your brain going. Like I said at the start of the video, the documentary is available to stream right now through Sky Crime on the Entertainment Pass via Now TV, which is £8.99 a month. There will be a link in the description of this video which you can click and it will take you there. I really do encourage you guys to go and give the documentary a watch. It's so interesting. Thank you to Now TV for working with me on this video. Like I said, I'm working with them on a few upcoming videos which I'm really excited about, and thank you to you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up, and like I said, let me know your opinions about this case and the documentary in the comments of this video. Let's get a discussion going. A special shout out to the members of my Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else is interested in becoming a member of the Patreon page, I will leave the link in the description of this video. And yeah, that is pretty much everything that I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you again soon for another one. Bye guys.